everybody, it's Gina here from Gina Makes It. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I am using dyes and texture paste to create beautiful designs on different types of vintage papers, book pages, envelopes, tags, vellum. It was sort of an experiment. I've had this idea for a little bit and I'm finally just putting it to practice. First thing that I did was gather up all of my dyes, and I don't really have that many dyes. I don't really use my Sizzix machine very much, so the dyes that I have are sort of limited, but I knew what I was looking for and I wanted ones that had sort of intricate designs to create sort of a relief texture on different items, tags and journal pages and even journal covers. That was really what was motivating me, is that I had this book that I wanted to do some rose designs on. So the first thing that I do is I just cut up some white cardstock and I am just running it through with the dye through my Sizzix machine, and I'm just poking out all of the little pieces of paper. And this is an extremely important part because you don't want any of the pieces left, because then when you go to use it as a stencil, you're not going to get the full image. And so these dyes right here are part of a Tim Holtz collection that I recently purchased, well, I would say like closer to March, April-ish, from Hobby Lobby, and I have linked them below, and I'll try and do that again if I can find them. I'm not sure how long these stay in store, how long these last, but ironically enough, my mom and I both had purchased these separately without knowing. So they're very pretty. They're a very vintage floral design. So I'm making 2 of each just because I know that I'm going to use different colors, and I know that the stencil isn't going to last forever. It's like a temporary stencil, and because I'm cutting it out on cardstock, I could just throw it out, run my dye through with some paper again, and create a whole nother stencil. So I kind of really like the idea of not having to clean anything, because that's actually one of the things that I hate about using stencils, is having to clean it, which makes me sound extremely lazy, but I don't want to take the time out to have to clean the stencil. So these 2 that I'm putting through right now are some die cuts that I recently bought from Sizzix online, and they were called like a folk art design, and they were clearance, so they were a very, very good price, and I just liked the designs on them. And so I'm just going through and I'm poking through and getting all the papers out. I am experimenting with these particular dyes because they do have intricate designs on them, but I do also use one butterfly that is just a solid butterfly, because I wanted to see how the texture paste would come through just a solid image. And it's okay, it's not as pretty or as vintagey looking as these designs itself, but it's just always good to experiment with different products so you know whether or not you like it. One other thing that I was thinking about this morning is that you don't only have to use dyes. If you don't own a Sizzix machine, you can also use punches. I do have some border punches that have some intricate doily designs, and I think that if you punch that out on some cardstock, that would also give you the same effect, or even just regular punches. So there's a lot of different ways to look at this using the supplies that you have. So now that I have them all punched out, all of those little pieces are out and cleaned up, I'm going to go through and just trim up the stencil, because I don't want any of that excess paper on it when it comes time to actually lay it down on top of the piece of paper that I'm going to be using it on, because the more I can see of the paper below or the medium below, the better transfer I'm going to get from stencil texture paste to end result. So after I get done trimming these, I'm going to just pile them underneath a stack of heavy books, because they did get a little bit rounded just from running through the Sizzix machine. And after I let them sit for about a half hour underneath these books, they're completely flat and they're perfect to use. So now we're moving on to step 2. We're going to start using our texture paste. I'm using the Tim Holtz texture paste. I like that it's in a tub, and I like it's sort of like whipped texture paste. It's nice and creamy, like frosting. So I have this little palette, and I got this palette from Hobby Lobby. They're very inexpensive. And I also have a little offset spatula that came in a Michaels bag of paintbrushes, economy paintbrushes. And I'm just using that to mix some paint in the texture paste. So I am looking for a very neutral beige. So I added too much brown paint, and I'm just using some acrylic paint that I had laying around, but I added a little bit too much. It was a little too dark, so I just went ahead and added a little bit more texture paste to try and lighten it up. So I think I'm finally at a spot here where I'm going to start trying out my die cut stencils. So I have some old receipts and book pages, different types of printables, just all sorts of things that I gathered up to try and test this out. So I used some washi tape to tape down the stencil at the top and the bottom, and I'm just lightly going over with my spatula, making sure that I get every single inch of that stencil covered with the texture paste. And I'm just kind of scraping a thin layer, and I pull it off, and I have a beautiful textured design on my book page. Now this is what had caused me to do this project in the first place. I have this book, and you can't really see on the cover, it's embossed and it says, "I never promised you a rose garden," and I just loved that, and the way that it was shaped was perfect for this rose die cut. And I kept thinking about it, and finally I thought, you know what, I'm just going to do it. I am just rubbing it across, and I'm going to pull it out, and then there is my stenciled texture pasted book cover, and I'm very excited about that. I think I'm going to turn that into an altered book. So I am just kind of scraping off some of the excess texture paste, and I just keep using the same stencil until I'm starting to get blurred results. And I don't necessarily dislike the blurred results, but if it becomes entirely too blurry or too smushed, then I know it's time to toss the stencil and move on to the next one. I used up all of that texture paste, but the experiment is not over. I decided to make some dusty rose texture paste. And so I started again with my texture paste on my palette, and I added just a little bit of pink and a little bit of brown, and I started mixing that together. But it wasn't quite pink enough for me, so I added just a little bit more pink and kept mushing it around, much like frosting, if you've ever tried to color frosting. And finally, I got to a color where I was pretty pleased with. And again, I'm just using regular acrylic paint that I had in my stash, and I think it was like a baby pink in that same middle of the ground brown that I was using. So I have some avocado dyed paper, and this is sort of the hue that I was going for, and I wanted to see what a more tone on tone would look like, because the last set it was a little bit lighter than the base, but I wanted this one to be very much so tone on tone. And I have to say, I really did love the results. This one might be my favorite. It truly is a tone on tone. I'm matching that color. It was a fluke. I have no idea how it happened, because I actually make another batch, and it is slightly darker, but yet it is still pretty close to that avocado dyed dusty rose. So these are just some printables. This is the back of a Victorian trade card. I am just using everything that I have at my fingertips to add some of this stenciled material to, because I know I'm going to be able to pull from this as I'm working in my journals with Junk Journal with Me's and just for other projects. It's nice to have a whole bunch of different items in your stash, and so not only does it sort of streamline the journaling process, but it also helps flow your creativity because you're not stopping to look to see what types of supplies that you have. I know when I have to keep stopping and saying like, well, what am I going to use now? It kind of stalls the creative process for me and it drags things out and then I lose interest. So creating upfront all sorts of items like this is something that's not only fun, but it's also beneficial for your overall practice. So here I am adding a little bit more of both of those paint colors to more texture paste, and I added a little bit more brown than I intended to, and so I add a little bit more pink. And like I said, this one is slightly darker, but it's still pretty close to the first one. Now I move on to the bigger stencils, one that has a little bit more of an intricate design. So I have it on some vellum and I am taping it just like I did the other ones, and basically I'm actually just doing the exact same thing that I did with the other stencils. I'm just making sure that I cover every area and that I don't get any onto my vellum because I don't know how I'm going to use this. I might use the whole sheet, I might cut around it, but I'm just making sure that I don't get any of that texture paste off of the stencil itself. And once I scrape it completely down, I pull it off, and I have to say, this is really pretty. This is the pink on the vellum is just, I was really admiring that for a while. I'm very pleased with how that turned out. How I'm going to use it, I have no idea. So here is the butterfly that I was talking about earlier. And so you can see it's kind of a thicker application. And so I thought that I would just use a few more, kind of use up the texture paste and create a couple more, and I thought maybe they would look good cut out. I wasn't sure. The jury is still out. I'm still not sure how I like it. I will say that I like the intricate designs a little bit more than I do these flat images, but you never know when you're going to use it. So I cleaned up my palette again, and once again, now I am experimenting with a darker texture paste. So I add a lot more brown to the texture paste, and I actually go back to my little art cart and I grab a few different color browns because it was a little bit too orangey for my liking. I wanted like a really deep brown because I wanted to see what the darker texture paste looked like on a lighter base. So I come back and I add a few more drops of different types of acrylics and I achieve a much darker, richer brown color, and then I start using it on my stencils. It's amazing what different colors will do on different papers with different textures. It gives such a different look, and I like all three of them because they're all very neutral, but yet they're different shades of neutral, and so it's just so interesting to experiment with this type of project. Now I am finishing up and I cleared off my palette and I have one stencil left to use, and I have this piece of vellum that was stained at the top with something. So I decide to use this last stencil with just some white texture paste. I don't do anything to the texture paste, and I'm really brave. I don't tape it down, and I'm kind of digging my spatula into that pot there, and it's kind of giving me a hard time. So I really should have taped it down the way I did the other ones, but that's okay because it turns out just fine. And I lift it off, and I have to say, this technique on vellum is very pretty. It just gives such a unique look. And so I decided to go through and just do different parts of the stencil for different sorts of effect. There were these little wispy leaves and these little hearts. And so I knew that I could cut this out and use this on different projects. Now I'm just going to clean up and show you my results. I was going to originally end the video there, but the pull to create something with some of these new goodies was entirely too strong. So after dinner, I sat down and I gathered up just a few scraps. I didn't want it to be anything in depth. I just wanted to kind of play at my craft table. And so I just grabbed some vintage wallpaper scraps and I tore the top off of this index card that I had used the texture paste on. And I decided to create a little bit of a pocket with the overhang from the bottom piece of that vintage wallpaper. And I also add a little bit of avocado dyed cheesecloth just to add a little bit of texture. And I thought that this would be a nice little addition to a journal page or some sort of a project, like a little card. I could do some journaling on the back side or add a picture to the back side or do some journaling and add it to the pocket right there. So I add a piece of vintage lace to the upper quadrant of that piece of vintage wallpaper just to add a little bit of interest. Since I used the textured paste on the back side of one of these printable Victorian trade cards, I thought, why not make a complete Victorian trade card? But I thought that I would create a little bit of a side pocket with it. Now, I print these out at all different sizes, so I don't even know if these are the two that go together, but they were very close to the same size. So I just decided to trim around the edges because the front was a little bit bigger than the back side. So I put glue on 3 sides, and now I have a pocket on the one side, but I felt like it really needed a little bit of decoration. But every time I added lace or fabric to it, it was like too much. I don't know if it was my mood or what. So I had these little scraps of these paper doilies in my stash, and so I thought that I would line the outside on one side with the doily, and then on the other side I use a little bit of ruffled avocado dyed paper to line the edge, and I end up folding up that lace doily just a little bit because it just seems a little bit too long the way that it currently is. While I let that dry, I move on to the final card that I'm going to be creating, and on the back side is the textured paste, and this is just an index card that I had coffee dyed. So I'm using the rest of that cheesecloth, and I have this oval picture that is from my Eyes of Wonder digital kit, and I did a little bit of sewing around it, and the colors in it match the avocado dyed cheesecloth perfectly. And then I have this little scrap of letter that I had printed on some linen paper, and it creates the perfect little pocket right there to add to some journaling pages. I ended up combining all 3 of these together. So in this larger pocket, I stuffed the 2 smaller pockets. And as I was doing it, I thought, gosh, this is really sweet. This is the sweetest little package. If I stuffed this with a few more vintage goodies, I would love to receive this in the mail. And then I wrapped it with a little bit of sari silk ribbon, and it was the perfect little package. I'm thinking about adding a few items like this to my Etsy store, some handmade items. If you would be interested in that, let me know. I'm just trying to gauge interest at this point. I'm also seriously thinking about pulling together some very limited quantity journal kits each month, and it would consist of some vintage quilts and vintage fabric, some vintage magazine articles and ephemera, stuff like that. So if that's something you'd be interested in, leave a comment down below, and that way I can kind of figure out if it's something I'm going to go ahead with. That's going to wrap up this video. As always, thanks so much for watching and supporting my channel. I really do appreciate it. I'll see you next time.